as you dig deeper and deeper into the way that the coffee is farmed and the way that it's processed and the way that it's roasted, you start seeing distinctions that actually matter.
Welcome to the Less Stressed Life podcast, where our only priority is providing those aha moments to uplevel your life, health, and happiness. Your host, integrative dietitian nutritionist Krista Bigler, helps health-conscious women reduce the stress and confusion around food, fatigue, digestive, and skin issues at lessstressednutrition.com. Now, on to the show.
Okay, today on The Less Stressed Life, we have Andrew Salisbury, who I met this fall, and he's an interesting guy, especially as I get to the end of this bio. So he's the founder of over 14 companies in the last 25 years in 6 countries, including Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Ireland, and the U.S. And we are going to be charmed by his lovely British accent today. His latest investment, which is Purity Coffee, is a project of passion. And he says that there is a big disconnect from what scientists have known over the 5 years of health benefits of coffee and the general public. So we're going to talk all about kind of his personal story and how he got into the coffee world and just the intricacies. I think sometimes people use a lot of coffee, but we don't talk about what's going on the background of coffee. So that'll be fun. So he believes that drinking healthier coffee is one of the easiest things you can do to improve your wellness, performance, and longevity. So aside from his passions related to coffee and health and entrepreneurship, he enjoys traveling with his wife and daughter. And I think it's cute that longevity is the quest now, because when I got his bio, it came with a video of Andrew setting a Guinness World Record for longest bungee jump in his youth. So fun, interesting guy. Maybe you can tell us about what led to the bungee jump, Andrew.
Yeah, a sign of a misspent youth, I think, but it was a lot of fun. One of the businesses I started a second commercial bungee jumping company in the US. And so jumping people from hot air balloons in San Francisco and bridges and tower cranes until ultimately I set up a business in Mexico and then went from there. And it's a long story, but I did the world record for the longest bungee jump, out of a helicopter in Cancun, which was fun.
Fun. Very cool. My daughter and husband did heli skiing last year, and our family's not bungee jumpers, but my husband and I met in skydiving. Well, this isn't exactly how we met, but we were both in skydiving club in college. So I at least at one time had a little bit of a thrill seeker, but I don't know if quite as much as you.
I love to skydive. It's a real sport. It really is. Yeah.
Oh, fun. So let's talk a little bit about coffee, which is something we're probably both drinking and possibly all the listeners have been drinking today. And some people don't like coffee, which is fine and wonderful too, but it gets used a lot and we don't necessarily talk about it. I mean, it hits headlines much like wine and chocolate do, like coffee is really healthy or maybe it's not healthy. Let's talk about, when did coffee really become this daily thing? And you're a world traveler, so maybe you can tell us what you see for coffee around the world, kind of culturally as well. But what do you think about coffee becoming this daily consumption? And let's talk about the pros and cons for health.
Yeah, and I think it's going through a very good trend and very similar to the way wine was first introduced, where, it's a very basic quality of wine, red wine, white wine. And then, as time goes on, people start recognizing different distinctions. So they pick the country, and then from there, they'll pick a region. And then as people get, more educated about wine, then they start saying, I'd like this farm and this terroir, and it needs to be this facing hill. And I think coffee is going through a similar evolution, which is that people are recognizing that not all coffee is created equal, even if you use taste as your only yardstick. When it comes to health, that's even more so, which is that, when it comes to the differences in really high quality coffee for health versus just regular coffee as an injection system for caffeine, there's just a huge range. And like most foods, you can, as you dig deeper and deeper into the way that the coffee is farmed and the way that it's processed and the way that it's roasted, you start seeing distinctions that actually matter. So I think the trend is very positive.
Yeah. So I think what may give us the proper landscape of why you got into this business is to talk about how it affected your personal life. Your wife, Amber, had some health issues and you decided coffee was a piece of it. Will you tell us that story?
Yeah, it was around 5 years ago when my wife was having some health issues, and we really couldn't put a finger on exactly what it was. Low energy, and she was, doing what a lot of us do, which is sort of self-medicating with coffee when we're a little bit tired. And so she was drinking just a lot of coffee, K-cup coffee, so really not the best quality coffee. But as a tea drinker back then, I had more than one argument trying to get her to slow down on the amount of coffee, because I honestly felt at the time that she was putting one foot on the accelerator, one foot on the brake at the same time, and she was just sort of overtaxing her body. And it sort of led me down this path of, truthfully, probably to win an argument, but led me down this path of researching the health benefits of coffee, really fully expecting to hear what I'd heard sort of in the periphery, which is that, cut down on the amount of coffee, too much caffeine isn't good for you. And what I heard was the complete reverse. I met two professors at the Institute of Coffee Studies in Vanderbilt, and they just gave me this shopping list of health benefits that are linked to coffee consumption and all of the science behind it. And that sort of set me down the path of trying to understand coffee more and understand if we could make every decision based on health, would we come up with anything that was different and measurably different? And that's sort of that was the impetus to start researching this.
Yeah, you're a curious guy. So I have to know, through your work and efforts, did you ultimately discern that was part of her health story?
I think ultimately we think that mold toxicity was probably the thing that was going on with her. So we did lots of things. We did, the big expensive things like remediating the house and also changing the foods that she would eat that would likely to have some sort of mold toxicity, and moving away from GMO and only getting organic. And all I can say is that combination of all the things we did, one of those things worked. But I can say, we switched the coffee, and that was the one, the silver bullet that fixed everything. But I can say that in hindsight, it's one thing that I think that people should concentrate on if they have a sensitivity to either mold or toxicity, or they have a sensitivity to regular coffee. It's a small adjustment relatively to pay attention to the quality of your coffee. So while I can't say it was the silver bullet, I can say it was a factor.
Well, I can tell you that clinically, in practice, I see coffee become an issue for some people in a few ways. So sometimes we're drinking so much of it that when we come off, we have like these major caffeine things. But more specifically in the context of what our conversation is today, I've had people, I love when they decide this, because I had made this discovery quite a while ago about myself, and it's alarming. I remember this client saying to me, hey, I feel fine when I drink this kind of coffee. And if I drink this like crappy gas station coffee, I totally feel like garbage. And I'm like, I couldn't agree more. I used to think I was really sensitive to caffeine or coffee. Turns out I actually don't even have that gene. That particular coffee sensitivity gene is not really an issue for me. It was really more about the quality of coffee. So I actually am a bit passionate about your topic as well, because I realized that as I was drinking coffee I would get like annoying, like crazy, hyped up, like revved me to this like a high and a low, and I'd crash. But if I was drinking organic or what was labeled fair trade, so I want to talk about all the labeling requirements around coffee, which you're probably well versed in now. If I was drinking something labeled like that, I was fine. It was very good. So let's talk about coffee labeling requirements and what do all these things mean exactly? And is it like, are these things that it's Scout's honor people put on the bag, or are there standards, in the industry for getting certain labels other than organic? Like, tell us all about labels.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big challenges we have is that there's lots of different things that impact coffee when it comes to the health benefits of coffee. And not all of them are going to be covered by labeling. They just need to be covered by best practices. But what happens in terms of labeling of coffee is that it's a very lax standard. So let me give you some of the ideas of things that matter and that should be covered by labeling. So, the first thing that really matters is your coffee needs to be organic. It's the most heavily treated crop on the planet. It's often treated in countries that don't have the same level of oversight that you do in the US. So things like glyphosate and just really poor quality pesticides are used on coffee because the yields are higher. So, when you've aligned financial interest to putting pesticides on coffee, you've got a lot of people who are going to cut corners because their yields are better. So you can get around that in a little way, or you can make sure that your labeling is certified USDA organic. But often often what happens is, what the labeling doesn't cover is that there's often pesticide runoff where local farms are using pesticides, and even if that particular farm isn't using pesticides, then you're going to have an impact of pesticide residue on the coffee that is certified organic. So you want it to be certified organic, and you also want it to be tested to be pesticide residue free, and that's when it becomes a little bit more difficult. Then the other thing that happens in coffee that we don't really have any labeling for, and you should ask your coffee producer to give you certifications that the coffee has been tested to be free of mold, yeast, ochratoxin A. So as you mentioned, sort of poor quality coffees, they cut a lot of corners, and there are some financial motives in adding water to coffee and humidity, and in the processing, there's places where mold arrives on the coffee, and that if you avoid those shortcuts, that doesn't have to happen. But the only way as a consumer you can guarantee that is just to ask for a certification that it's been tested, your coffee has been tested free of mold. And there's a number of companies doing that, and I think the trend is moving in a positive direction, that people are starting to insist on that, which is great news.
You're in the market, so you see that there's a lot of companies. I still feel like there's few companies that are saying that, right? Because it's very, very voluntary, and it's not going to be a very easy certification, right? I mean, it's technically that easy, because and feel free to continue more about labeling at the same time, but let's talk about, I think this is an issue for both chocolate or cocoa beans, right? And coffee beans. Why is mold such a problem when growing and drying?
Well, I'll give you a couple of examples of how mold develops and based on different farming practices. So one of the shortcuts we've talked about is industrial farming. So if you go to an industrial coffee farm, you're going to see coffee trees in straight rows with enough of a gap between them that a tractor can go between those rows and pull off all of the coffee cherries at the same time. Now, the reason they would do that is because coffee cherries ripen at different times, and it's very cumbersome and expensive for them to handpick and hand select those cherries. So what they've decided to do in industrial farming is, let's just pull off everything at the same time. So we've got overripe cherries, which are moldy, we've got underripe cherries, which are green, and we've got ripe cherries, which are in most cases red. And so what happens is these trailers will pull off all the cherries, and they'll pull off, the twigs and in some cases stones, and then they'll have to sort afterwards to remove the coffee cherries that are moldy. The problem is that it's like taking a moldy strawberry and putting it in a vat of fresh strawberries, and coming back the next day, you'll find all the strawberries are moldy. So what you've got, the problem you're dealing with is, once you start introducing mold, or once mold is introduced into your coffee, it becomes very difficult to avoid. So what we insist on is all of our coffee needs to be grown in natural habitat. And there's some monikers, there's some labeling that you could look for that could sort of indicate that the coffee is grown in the right way. The indications are that it's bird friendly. Smithsonian bird friendly is a good label to show it's grown in its natural habitat. Hand picked and hand selected is another good label. The fact that it's shade grown is a great label to look for. We're hoping to move in standards of regenerative farming, where it really is just the very best of farming conditions. But that's one thing to look for. And then, I'll give you another example of how mold can be introduced. I was visiting a farm in Brazil, and it was an industrial farm, and I was trying to understand the contrast between industrial farming and regenerative farming. And there's this big pile of coffee that is dry and is ready to be sacked and processed for weight. And there was a farmer who was spraying the pile of coffee with water. When I asked him why he would do that, what was the purpose of cleaning the coffee at this stage, and he told me that basically the purpose was to add water to the coffee, which was already dry. And by adding water to the coffee, and it soaks up an additional 8 or 10% water, then the yields are higher for the farmer because, it's heavier. Mm-hmm. So then, of course, the challenge there is that you're shipping the coffee, and it's going to take a couple of months to arrive at this destination, and you're shipping a moist product, which is, there are more, but, that's just two examples.
Yeah, that's a great point. And this brings up a solid point in general, is that, one, we don't necessarily talk about mold intake in our diets, and not that people should be wildly alarmed, but mold is becoming a bigger problem. And so if we can do little things, like if you're doing something every day, like if you're drinking coffee every day, then it's a really recurrent thing, right? And so you're just reintroducing that every day. Some other foods, you're not eating those every day, right? In the same way, or something I think is really important that you mentioned is that coffee is a very heavily treated crop, but we don't necessarily poo-poo on coffee kind of like we do the U.S. grain market. People like talk about it in kind of a not always a friendly way. And with the coffee, we don't necessarily talk about it. So I'm glad we're having this conversation. Now, you mentioned something that I feel like I see this label a lot, or I like this label, which is shade grown. For some reason, that coffee works well as for me as well. Why is shade grown? Is it just because I was just guessing that when we've got a couple labels, like this particular coffee is just grown with more integrity, and that might be the bottom line. But tell me what's actually happening what does this look like? You mentioned that the coffee groves, when they're farmed, are set apart, et cetera. But when something is shade grown, what does that mean exactly?
Yeah, so it's actually an interesting story for us. So we decided to make every decision based on health. And our focus was, without compromise, we would look at every decision and decide what's the best in terms of creating a healthy product. So the first thing that we wanted to do is have a very high antioxidant rich coffee. And antioxidants vary from crop to crop and harvest to harvest. So the only way for us to be able to really tell which coffee was highest in antioxidants was to lab test 40 or 50 organic coffees from around the world and pick the ones that were highest. Now, what happened from doing that is we started to see a correlation. We started to see something. So even though we didn't have any requirement apart from the fact that it was organic and specialty grade coffee, and we were testing for antioxidants, we started to see a trend. And the trend was the natural the conditions that the coffee was grown in, the higher it was in antioxidants and more nutrient rich for the things that we were looking for in the coffee. So that's when we started to get deeper into, well, why does this matter? So the things we look for now is Smithsonian bird friendly, shade grown, all of these things. And this is a long way of telling you that the reason why this matters is through industrial farming, the soil conditions get really depleted. So there's an over-reliance on the use of pesticides, which are a shortcut, and the more natural the farming conditions for the coffee. So if it's grown in shade grown, which means that there's other trees around, they're also growing banana and papaya and mango, the soil coverage, which you mean leaves and compost, so that the soil is richer and it's more protected. What we find is the direct result of that, and bird friendly just means that while we care about the environment, our driver wasn't the environment, our driver was health benefits. We noticed that the farms that produced in a bird-friendly environment meant that the coffee was grown in such a way that it wasn't driving off the birds. So that was a great indicator that if we look for bird-friendly, then we could say, okay, this is likely to be coffee grown in this natural environment. And it helped us narrow down a crowded field. And
as a consumer, this is great. But as the farmer, that's giving up a lot. If you're saying, hey, we're willingly allowing birds to eat our coffee. It's kind of actually a big deal for that farmer to say, hey, this is kind of okay. We're going to give a little bit back to nature because it's cutting into our profits, right? There's a difference here. Yeah. And as the consumer, we only see what we think benefits us, but we have to know that in some ways, right, there's a reason we have this higher cost because the yield is going to be lower, right? We're going to lose some of this to birds. We're going to lose some of it to other places. I just want to point out, all the people in the pie here, it's kind of a big deal when the farmer says, okay, we're going to do it this way instead of a different way, I think.
Yeah, and it's really long-term thinking because, what we hope to encourage is that people will start to recognize that drinking coffee based on health is important. It's an incredibly healthy product, number one source of antioxidants in the American diet. But the problem is that it's not enough to say that coffee is good for you. You have to say, well, how and what part of coffee and why is it good for you? And when you start digging in a little deeper, you start to recognize that the farmers that are really doing a good job in terms of artisanal farming, and they're producing the coffee at a very high level. And as you mentioned, it can be a little bit more expensive. Those farmers need to be rewarded, and they will be rewarded as people start to recognize that the coffee is a health food and is something that they should pay attention to, I think.
I do want to get into some specifics about coffee health. So we don't say coffee is healthy. We want to be really specific about pros and cons. But you said something a little bit earlier, and I wanted to reiterate and make sure I got it right. You said that the higher elevation that the coffee is grown, the more antioxidants. Was that correct?
I don't know if I say that, but it is correct. There's no one thing. Like, you can't just pick the highest elevation and go, that's going to have the most antioxidants, but it is one indicator, just like regenerative farming is an indicator. Volcanic soil. Yeah, volcanic soil is an indicator as well. I mean, that what we find is that coffee grown on a hillside in natural conditions with volcanic soil tend to be higher than other ones. And the range, it can be huge. I mean, some coffees that we've tested were 5% of the antioxidants of our coffee. So there's a big range.
Sure.
But you're right, altitude matters.
Well, let's talk about where coffee is grown in the world, because what's most common to see on package? It's Arabica and a couple other ones. So can you shed some light on that? Because I think most people don't necessarily know what we're looking for exactly.
Most people are drinking Arabica coffee. The other second most common coffee is Robusta. Robusta is actually, it's considered sort of a filler coffee, and it's difficult to find in organic form. It's often used in instant coffees, and used as a coffee where they'll mix it with Arabica and Robusta to a level where it won't change the taste too much, but it's a lot cheaper coffee. So it's used as a filler coffee. Ironically enough, actually, Robusta is higher in antioxidants than Arabica is, but it's hard to find really good quality Robusta that's organic.
And it's grown they get this name because they're grown at a different place in relationship to the equator. Is that correct?
I think it's just where it's planted. I mean, India tends to grow a lot of Robusta, and South and Central America is much more Arabica. Asia has more Robusta Asia in general has more Robusta coffee because they have the landmass and they really just want, they see it as a commodity crop.
You are using Arabica. Is that correct?
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
Which is standard. I mean, most of the coffees that you buy are going to be Arabica coffees. If you're looking at any sort of quality coffee, it's likely you're drinking an Arabica coffee. That's sort of like a basic requirement.
All right. I want to get into those health benefits, but then I was just thinking about quote unquote food waste. And I've heard this not talked about too often, but we're talking about a coffee berry. And obviously the berry gets stripped off and we're using basically the inside. So are there uses in the industry for the rest of the coffee plant? What do you know about that?
Absolutely. It's such an interesting subject. I mean, cascara is the fruit of the coffee cherry that is dried. It's very high in antioxidants. The people are working on different usages for it. One is coffee flour. Cascara can be used for tea. I think it's a really interesting subject. It's something that we're playing around with on the periphery, but we're trying not to lose focus because, our intent is with 164 million Americans who get up this morning and drink a cup of coffee, we don't necessarily need to change a behavior to get them to drink, cascara tea, even though it could be a good benefit for them. It's still early days in terms of finding really good quality sourcing, because one of the problems is with the coffee cherry, you want to really be very careful about mold. So it's obviously got to be organic because, as you mentioned, it's like a grape. So when it's sprayed by pesticides, it's very, very porous and it's going to absorb a lot of this. So it's got to be organic, and it also needs to be processed on site because the last thing you want is molding fruit in your finished product. So we're playing around with that, but it is a really interesting subject.
Yeah. I think one of Purity's kind of goal, your target market, I believe, is consumers, and you try to work with health professionals to help them convey the message of the importance of quality coffee to their clients. But is Purity used in coffee shops, or do you see that? Is that something you hope to see more often, or maybe it's already being done frequently? I don't live in a place where I would see this, but tell me about that.
Yeah, I'll tell you our thought process. Our thought process is vision is better health through coffee. And the very best way for us to do that, we feel, is to have a story that's delivered through healthcare professionals who can talk about the health benefits of coffee and explain the differences. So we feel like we would be lost if we tried to go retail and you saw us among another 50 coffees in your public store or wherever. So our focus is we really want to deliver this message through wellness professionals first and support them as our conduit. That's one of the reasons we're not on Amazon, we're not in retail, we're direct to consumers. And another reason for that is that most people are drinking stale coffee. So if your coffee was roasted more than 15 days ago, and some people, in some cases, especially with large chains, you're buying coffee that was roasted months ago, you're losing a lot of the antioxidants. And we wanted a way that we could deliver the coffee to people just after it was roasted. So, we basically roast daily and we send send out the roast the day that you order it, and so you're receiving the coffee 2 to 3 days after roasting. And it becomes difficult to provide that high level of quality when you go retail.
Yeah. So where is the coffee grown? Where is it roasted? And how do you make the best cup of coffee?
Wow, big questions. Where's it grown? So the choice of our coffee is driven by what the lab results tell us is in that coffee. So I can tell you right now, our coffee is a blend of Colombian and Honduran coffee. And that's because the 50 or so that we tested, these were the very highest in polyphenols, in antioxidants, while still having the high standards we have, which is that it's organic and it's specially grade, it's mold-free, it's tested to be free of pesticide residue, all these other things. So that may change, though. I mean, we're constantly trying to beat our last coffee in terms of quality of antioxidants and the quality of the coffee. And so we'll continue to look, and our coffee will evolve over time as we learn more. We've just come out with a dark roast, for example, and we only had one standard coffee, but we came out with a dark roast because we recognized there were certain compounds in a darker roast that we could dial up that we couldn't get in a lighter roast. And for that reason, we said, okay, we're going to provide this coffee for these sort of sensitivities or this sort of area of focus. We made every decision based on health. One thing that really does have a big impact is the technology you use to roast the coffee. So we use a smokeless roasting system, we've done some work on development of this, which is reducing the amount of oxygen in the roast. What it does is that traps in the antioxidants and gives you a higher level of antioxidants that are retained in the coffee. At the same time, it doesn't build up a thing called acrylamide, which you get in the early stage of roasting. So roasting makes a big difference. In fact, 50% of the battle here, first 50% is in production, finding a coffee that is just incredibly high quality and hits all the standards that we just talked about. But the second thing is if you don't roast it in the right way, then you're going to lose a lot of these benefits. So that final mile is incredibly important to play around with what we call the roast curve, which is, temperature versus time, to maintain the antioxidants in the coffee and not have any of the negative compounds that can be created in roasting, like acrylamide at the early stage or polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons at the later stage, which you get from any sort of charred or burnt food.
Yeah. Acrylamide is a carcinogen as well. So we want not so much of that, right?
That's right. And there's been a lot of fuss about, Proposition 65 and acrylamide in coffee. And the truth of the matter is that there's minute levels of acrylamide in coffee. You can manage to roast those if you pay attention to the way you roast the coffee, which is what we do, and we lab test along the roast curve. You can really minimize the amount of acrylamide in coffee. But even having said that, you would have to drink 200 cups of purity coffee to get the same acrylamide as in one large French fries from a fast food.
I like numbers like that. Thank you. So let's get back to making that. I think talking about how to make a perfect cup of coffee is a great way to end, but let's talk about the benefits of coffee. So we're talking about antioxidants, and the people listening are smart people, but antioxidants, we usually think we're getting those often from our colorful fruits and vegetables, and antioxidants combat against free radicals, which are basically what cause wrinkles and aging and disease. So I know you have a favorite study about coffee, but when we're thinking about high levels of antioxidants, if you can bump up any antioxidant value during the day, you're essentially you're just kind of preventing the things that result in aging. Anything you want to add to that? But go ahead and tell us about kind of I know you started this company by getting into the research and realizing that this was a gap in the market. Like people were not really doing coffee for health. So tell us, what were some of the things that you found in your own research?
Yeah. And so we've been very lucky since the beginning to have some guidance for some real experts in this industry. And one of them is Dr. Adriana Ferrar from the University of Brazil, the largest coffee producing country in the world. And Adriana's specialty is coffee and health. And so she started working with us. So the reason I say that we were very lucky is that, 30 years of doing her own own research. She's one of the most published coffee scientists on health in the world. She consults for the World Health Organization. She was able to direct us in the early stages to what mattered in coffee when it came to health. And at the same time, she validated for me that the health benefits of coffee. So I know you have a lot of doctors who are listening. The first thing I would say is that coffee is one of the most well-studied foods on the planet. And there's just so much information around the health benefits of coffee. And while I can point to studies and studies that are on our website as well that you can download, I really encourage people just to take a look at them, particularly in terms of coffee and the prevention of type 2 diabetes, coffee in terms of liver health, and also overall longevity. There was a very large study by the British Medical Journal that was an umbrella study of over 200 individual coffee studies and put them together, and they showed that coffee drinkers, and these are all peer-reviewed studies, these are large peer-reviewed studies, talked about how coffee drinkers 3 to 5 cups of coffee a day had anywhere from a 12 to 16% lower chance of all form of mortality in the 10-year period that the study was done, which is pretty staggering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. How did you get Dr. Adriana on your team? Like, how do you go? You just go find the most renowned researcher in coffee and call her?
Yeah, that's it. That was exactly it. It was the professors at the Institute of Coffee Studies recommended me to Adriana. And what was easy about the conversation is Adriana was a little bit frustrated. And all the time that she'd been working on the health benefits of coffee, she should still see that the general public would be talking about how they could cut down on coffee for New Year's and minimize their coffee intake. And there was really a mixed bag. And she said, look, this is faulty science. The health benefits of coffee are well proven. We know the things that make a difference in coffee to improve the health benefits of coffee. We know the focus on antioxidants is important. We know the absence of the bad stuff. We know how to create this in both the roast and also on the farm. And she was frustrated that what she'd done for all of these years in terms of research and studies on the health benefits of coffee just hadn't trickled down to the general public. So I think really what excited her the most is the fact that we are the conduit to get the information that she knows about the health benefits of coffee to the general public, because we're, where the rubber meets the road. We have the ability to affect things locally on the farm and to affect things in the roaster and to dial up the compounds that she feels are beneficial. And so, she was a great guide, and our interests are aligned in this.
Yeah, I imagine any researcher I talk to, they would love to get their message out, right? Because that is hard work and you want more people to notice it. So yeah. I love great coffee, but I struggle to make it very well at home. I've got everything, the French press and the pour over and the mochi pot and the espresso machine. So talk to us about basics on making a great cup of coffee.
Yeah, there's a lot of information for people who talk to you about taste, and taste obviously makes a big difference. But when it comes to extracting the coffee through different methods, it's all about grind size, the temperature of the water, and the pressure that's applied to the coffee. So if you're doing an espresso coffee or if you're doing a French press, then there's actual pressure applied to the coffee and you're extracting more of the chlorogenic acids, the antioxidants in the coffee. And then there's the other methods, obviously pour over, that's very good. But if every single method will extract different compounds in the coffee. So there isn't one really easy answer. I can tell you that I use a pour over in the morning, and that's sort of my preferred method. And I like an occasional espresso in the afternoon. And I think in terms of extracting the antioxidants in the coffee, you can't go wrong with espresso. It's a very good way of doing it. And pour over is great as well. And cold brew is another great method to extract coffee, because the coffee is sitting in the water for 24 hours in the fridge, and you're extracting most of the beneficial compounds that way.
Very fun. Andrew, we can talk about where people can find you, but I know Purity they pour a lot of efforts into education and so if someone's a health professional listening to this, Purity has kind of like a program for coffee discounts, et cetera, to get this in the hands of their consumers. I also, on my website, have a little spot in the shop section, but where can people find Purity online?
puritycoffee.com. Just go online and dig around. Our focus is we really want to help educate. So we want to make sure that our site, you can have access to the studies that are on. They talk about the health benefits of coffee, and you can learn yourself about different benefits, and also the compounds that matter, the way we roast our coffee, the way our coffee compares to other companies. But so the goal is to give as much education as possible. So it's puritycoffee.com, and feel free to just go in and look around. Lots of information there.
Yeah, they have got good stuff. Thank you so much for coming on today, Andrew. And I can tell you that I'm drinking some very smooth coffee right now. So
that's great. Good stuff. Excellent.
One of the best gifts you could give us at The Less Stressed Life is your feedback. We are paid in podcast reviews. If you enjoyed this or any other episode, please leave us a review. In the iTunes store or from your podcast app, just search for Less Stressed Life as if you're not already subscribed. Click on the banana face image, scroll to the bottom where it shows the text of other reviews, and write a review. While you're there, hey, make sure you hit subscribe. For Android or Stitcher users, you gotta go to the desktop site and search for Less Stressed Life, and then scroll down to leave a review. Stitcher doesn't load Apple reviews on their site, so if you want, you can leave a review in both places. Your feedback means a lot to the success of the show. Thanks so much for taking the time to do that. You rock.